Teen boy helps elderly man fix his roof. Weeks later, he's invited to a meeting that changes his life. The autumn wind howled through Chester Avenue as DeAndre Mitchell pedaled his worn bicycle past rows of aging houses. That's when he heard a faint cry for help carried on the breeze. Through the morning mist, he spotted an elderly man teetering dangerously on a ladder, reaching for loose shingles on his roof. DeAndre's heart stopped as the ladder shifted. In that split second, police sirens wailed in the distance, a sound that usually made the 16-year-old black teen pedal faster. But not today. Today, he made a choice that would change lives forever. Before we dive into this touching story, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments and hit that like button. Your support means the world to us. Let's begin. In the heart of Philadelphia's struggling Westbrook district, 16-year-old DeAndre Mitchell carried the weight of his father's memory with every step. 4 years ago, Marcus Mitchell, a skilled construction worker known for his perfectionism and integrity, fell to his death at the Parker construction site. The official report called it an unfortunate accident. But the worn safety harness and questionable scaffolding told a different story, one that the Mitchell family couldn't afford to investigate. Sarah Mitchell, DeAndre's mother, transformed her grief into relentless determination. Each day began at 4 a.m. when she'd kiss her sleeping son's forehead before heading to her first job as a hospital cleaner. By afternoon, she was serving tables at Lou's Diner, and evenings found her organizing files at a local insurance company. The constant exhaustion lined her face, but her spirit remained unbroken. Their modest 2-bedroom apartment was filled with past due notices, but Sarah ensured DeAndre never went hungry, even if it meant skipping meals herself. Despite their circumstances, DeAndre excelled academically. His backpack contained worn textbooks and perfect math tests. Dreams of becoming an engineer scribbled in margins. Teachers at Westbrook high praised his analytical mind and dedication, though few knew he studied under streetlights after his mother's late shifts, their electricity often cut off due to unpaid bills. His father's old construction manuals became his bedtime reading, each page a connection to the man he lost too soon. But Westbrook streets held different expectations for a black teenager. Store owners followed him through aisles, elderly residents clutched their bags tighter when he passed, and local police seemed to know his name without ever knowing him. The same officers who dismissed his mother's questions about Marcus's death now watched DeAndre's every move, waiting for him to fulfill their prejudiced prophecies. The neighborhood itself was changing. New development companies were buying up properties, pushing out families who'd lived there for generations. DeAndre watched childhood friends disappear one by one, their homes transformed into trendy cafes and boutiques. The community center where his father once taught him to draw blueprints now stood empty, awaiting demolition. At school, DeAndre kept to himself, carrying the invisible burden of being the dead construction worker's son. His college dreams seemed to mock him. Acceptance letters would likely arrive with price tags far beyond their reach. The scholarship applications piled up on their kitchen table, each one a desperate grab at opportunity. His mother found him late some nights, asleep over half-completed forms, his father's old hard hat sitting nearby like a silent guardian. Yet DeAndre inherited more than just his father's love for construction. Marcus Mitchell's unwavering moral compass lived on in his son. When other teens his age were finding trouble, DeAndre spent weekends helping elderly neighbors with repairs they couldn't afford. Each fixed fence or repaired step was a tribute to his father's memory, though these same neighbors often called the police when seeing him walk down their streets after dark. The irony wasn't lost on him. The community simultaneously feared and needed him. His mother worried about his safety but understood his need to help others. "Your father built things to last," she'd tell him, "but you, my son, you're building something even more important, trust." Those words echoed in his mind every time he picked up his father's old tools, determined to prove that character couldn't be judged by color or circumstance. The weight of prejudice, poverty, and lost opportunities might have crushed another young man, but DeAndre channeled his frustrations into his studies and his father's passion for building. Each perfect grade was a brick in the foundation of his future, each act of kindness a beam supporting his resolve. In his heart, he knew his father would have wanted him to build bridges rather than walls, even in a community that sometimes seemed determined to keep him on the outside looking in. This was the DeAndre Mitchell who pedaled through Chester Avenue that fateful autumn morning, a boy forced to become a man too soon, carrying dreams as heavy as his father's tools and a spirit that refused to be demolished by circumstance or prejudice. What he couldn't know was that destiny had placed a rickety ladder, an elderly man, and a chance for change in his path, about to test everything his father had taught him about building foundations that last. Henry Morrison's weathered hands told the story of a life spent building America. At 78, his once commanding presence had softened, but his eyes still held the sharp attention to detail that had made Morrison Construction one of Philadelphia's most respected family businesses for 3 generations. Now, those same eyes watched helplessly as developers transformed his beloved Westbrook neighborhood into an unrecognizable landscape of chrome and glass. The modest 2-story Victorian at 1423 Chester Avenue had been his home for 50 years, each creaking floorboard and stubborn window holding memories of a happier time. Sarah, his wife of 45 years, had filled these rooms with laughter and the scent of fresh-baked cookies for neighborhood children until cancer claimed her 5 years ago. Her garden still bloomed defiantly in the backyard, though Henry's arthritic hands struggled to maintain it against the encroaching weeds. Morrison Construction had been more than just a company, it was a legacy of integrity. Henry had learned the trade from his father, who believed in building homes that would shelter generations. But times changed, and larger corporations with cheaper materials and corner-cutting practices pushed family businesses to the margins. Rather than compromise his standards, Henry had sold the company, though the decision haunted him as he watched new buildings rise with foundations he knew wouldn't last. The Westbrook he knew was disappearing. Gleaming real estate offices replaced corner stores where he'd bought penny candy as a boy. The Sterling Development Corporation, led by the ruthless James Maxwell, had systematically bought out his neighbors, transforming familiar family homes into luxury condominiums. Their offers for Henry's house grew more aggressive with each passing month, but he stood firm. This home was Sarah's last gift to him, and no amount of money could price memories. Loneliness was Henry's constant companion now. His own children, successful professionals in distant cities, called dutifully on holidays but rarely visited. The neighbors who'd shared Sunday barbecues and holiday celebrations had all moved away or passed on. Sometimes he caught himself talking to Sarah's photographs, sharing his fears about the threatening letters from Sterling Development or the mysterious accidents that plagued his property: broken windows, damaged gutters, and vandalized garden. Yet Henry Morrison was no stranger to fighting battles. In the 1960s, he'd defied local business conventions by hiring black workers when other contractors wouldn't. He'd stood up to corrupt inspectors who demanded bribes, even when it cost him contracts. His reputation for fairness had earned him respect across racial and social lines, though few of those old friends remained in the changing neighborhood. The local police, once regular guests at his Sunday dinners, now seemed indifferent to his complaints about harassment from developers. Officer Thompson, whose father Henry had given a first job to 30 years ago, merely suggested he consider Sterling's generous offer. The message was clear: the old Westbrook was dying, and Henry Morrison was expected to die with it quietly. Each morning, Henry rose at dawn, a habit from decades of construction work. He'd sit in Sarah's favorite chair, watching the neighborhood wake up through windows that needed cleaning. The young families hurrying past rarely noticed the elderly man who'd built many of their homes. The few who did see him probably wondered why he stubbornly clung to his outdated house while progress marched on around him. What they couldn't understand was that Henry wasn't just protecting a house, he was guarding a principle. His home stood as a last testament to a time when craftsmanship mattered more than profit, when neighborhoods were communities rather than investment opportunities. The Victorian sturdy bones and hand-carved details represented everything that modern, rushed construction had forgotten. As his abilities declined with age, Henry fought a private war against time and deterioration. Each loose shingle and creaking step reminded him of his growing limitations. His tool belt, worn smooth by decades of use, hung in the garage like a retired warrior's sword. Pride kept him from seeking help, even as simple repairs became dangerous challenges. Sarah would have scolded him for climbing ladders at his age, but without her, this house was all he had left to fight for. This was the Henry Morrison who stood precariously on his ladder that autumn morning, a guardian of old values in a changing world, a man who had built his life on solid foundations, now watching them erode beneath the relentless tide of progress. What he didn't know was that fate was about to send him an unlikely ally in his fight to preserve not just a house, but a way of life that seemed all but lost. The morning air bit sharply as DeAndre's bike tires crunched over fallen leaves. The cry for help came again, clearer this time, pulling him to a stop before a Victorian house that seemed to sag beneath the weight of time. Through the autumn mist, he spotted Henry Morrison wobbling atop an ancient wooden ladder, his trembling hands reaching for loose shingles that flapped like broken wings in the wind. Time slowed to a heartbeat as the ladder shifted. Henry's arms pinwheeled against the gray sky, his tool belt clattering as screwdrivers and hammers rained down onto the unkempt lawn. Without thinking, DeAndre dropped his bike and sprinted across the yard. His father's voice echoed in his mind, "Son, a split second can be the difference between life and death on a construction site." The ladder lurched again just as DeAndre reached it. His strong young hand steadied the worn wood, muscles straining as he felt Henry's weight shift above. "Hold on, sir," he called up. "I've got the ladder. Try to climb down slowly." The old man's shoes, scuffed and worn like everything else about him, began a shaky descent. That's when the police cruiser rounded the corner. Officer James Bradley had patrolled Westbrook for 20 years and, like many, viewed change through a lens of suspicion. The sight of a black teenager at a ladder propped against an elderly resident's house triggered an immediate response. The cruiser's tires squealed as it pulled to the curb, and Bradley's hand instinctively moved to his weapon. "Step away from the ladder." "Hands where I can see them," Bradley's voice boomed through the morning quiet. DeAndre's heart raced, but he couldn't let go, not with Henry still 3 rungs up. "Sir, please," he called back, voice steady despite his fear. "I'm just helping him down." He almost fell. A second police car arrived, its siren cutting through the neighborhood's peace. Curtains twitched in nearby windows as residents emerged to witness the unfolding scene. Mrs. Peterson from next door already had her phone out, no doubt calling 911 about a suspicious character on their street. Henry's voice cracked through the tension like a whip. "What in God's name are you doing?" he demanded, now safely on the ground. Despite his age, he drew himself up to his full height, placing himself between DeAndre and the officers. "This young man just saved my life, and you're treating him like a criminal." Bradley's hand remained on his weapon. "Mr. Morrison, we received calls about a possible break-in. Are you sure you're okay?" The implication in his tone was clear. How could this teenager be anything but trouble? Break-in. Henry's laugh was bitter. "The only breaking happening around here is being done by Sterling Development's thugs. But I don't see you drawing weapons on them." He turned to DeAndre, who stood quietly, hands still visible, face composed despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "What's your name, son?" "DeAndre Mitchell, sir." "My father was Marcus Mitchell." The name recognition flickered across Henry's face. Marcus's death had made local headlines, though the investigation had been suspiciously brief. More neighbors had gathered now, their whispers carrying on the wind. Bradley finally lowered his hand from his weapon, but his stance remained hostile. "You need to move along, kid. Mr. Morrison, if you need any help with home repairs, the community center has a senior assistance program." Henry's voice took on a steel edge that reminded everyone of the respected businessman he'd once been. "DeAndre stays. My roof needs fixing, and I'm hiring him to do it. Unless you're planning to arrest me for employing someone to repair my own home." The gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably. Through a gap in the onlookers, DeAndre spotted Jennifer Thompson, a local journalist known for her investigative pieces on community issues. She was already taking notes, her presence adding another layer to the morning's drama. As the police reluctantly departed, Henry turned to DeAndre with an apologetic smile that creased his weathered face. "Now, about that roof, I assume you know your way around construction work." There was something in his eyes, respect, understanding, and perhaps a glimmer of hope. DeAndre looked up at the Victorian's damaged roof, then down at the scattered tools he was already gathering from the lawn. "Yes, sir. My father taught me everything he knew." He paused, then added quietly, "He always said the most important tool in construction isn't in any toolbox, it's trust." Henry nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in those words. Neither man could know it then, but that moment on a leaf-strewn lawn would ripple out to challenge not just their own prejudices, but those of an entire community. The real construction work about to begin had nothing to do with shingles and everything to do with building bridges across the chasms that divided them. The days following the latter incident rippled through Westbrook like aftershocks from an earthquake. While DeAndre worked methodically on Henry's roof, the neighborhood buzzed with conflicting narratives. Some residents, led by the vocal Mrs. Peterson, started a neighborhood watch specifically targeting suspicious youth. Others, moved by Jennifer Thompson's front-page article titled "Heroism Meets Prejudice on Chester Avenue," began questioning their own biases. DeAndre arrived each day after school, his father's old tool belt now complementing his backpack. Henry watched from below, offering guidance drawn from decades of experience, their conversations flowing naturally from proper shingle placement to deeper matters of life. The old contractor found himself impressed not just by the teen's workmanship, but by his thoughtful questions and quiet determination. "Your father taught you well," Henry remarked one afternoon, passing up a water bottle. DeAndre paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "He used to say every nail matters, even the ones nobody sees," the words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Henry nodded, remembering similar wisdom from his own father. As autumn days shortened, their connection deepened beyond mere construction work. Henry discovered DeAndre's impressive grades and engineering aspirations. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, ambitious, hardworking, but facing barriers he hadn't earned. When DeAndre mentioned studying under streetlights due to unpaid electricity bills, Henry's heart clenched. That evening, he discovered some old engineering textbooks in his attic and insisted DeAndre study at his well-lit kitchen table. Sarah Mitchell noticed changes in her son. The weight of anger he'd carried since his father's death seemed lighter. She met Henry one evening when picking DeAndre up, and something in the old man's gentle respect brought tears to her eyes. For the first time since Marcus's death, she felt someone else looking out for her boy. But not everyone celebrated their friendship. Anonymous notes appeared in Henry's mailbox, warning about keeping bad company. DeAndre occasionally caught glimpses of Sterling Development's black SUVs crawling past, their tinted windows concealing watching eyes. The local police drove by more frequently, their presence less protective than predatory. One rainy afternoon, Henry found DeAndre in his garage, transfixed by old photographs of Morrison construction projects. "That's the children's hospital wing we built in '85, Henry explained, pointing to a younger version of himself at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. "Built it to last." Like everything else, his voice carried a hint of bitterness. "Not like these cardboard boxes they're putting up now." DeAndre hesitated, then pulled out a worn newspaper clipping from his backpack, the article about his father's death at Parker Construction. Henry's eyes narrowed as he read, his construction expertise noting details that hadn't made the official report. "Safety violations," he muttered. Clear as day, he looked at DeAndre with new understanding, recognizing the burden of unresolved justice the boy carried. Their conversations began extending beyond construction. Henry shared stories of building Westbrook during the civil rights era, of standing up to discriminatory housing practices, of meeting Sarah at a construction site where she was the only female architect. DeAndre absorbed these histories, seeing his own struggles reflected in a longer arc of change and resistance. During breaks, they'd sit on Henry's porch, sharing Sarah's old cookie recipe that Henry had finally mastered. Neighbors who initially crossed the street to avoid DeAndre gradually began stopping to chat, drawn by Henry's obvious trust in the young man. Even Mrs. Peterson, after watching DeAndre carefully repair her fence one Saturday, grudgingly admitted she might have been hasty in her judgments. But beneath their growing friendship lay darker currents. Henry's mail increasingly included threatening letters from Sterling Development. DeAndre noticed suspicious damage appearing overnight: loose boards, missing shingles, marks that suggested deliberate vandalism rather than natural wear. He began documenting everything with his phone, a habit born from years of learning to protect himself against false accusations. One evening, as sunset painted the repaired roof in golden hues, Henry shared his fears about the neighborhood's transformation. "They're not just changing buildings," he said, gazing at the modern apartments rising nearby. "They're erasing history, community, everything that makes a place worth living in." DeAndre understood he'd watched the same process devour his childhood landmarks. Neither could have predicted how their simple rooftop repair would evolve into something larger, more significant. Their unlikely friendship was becoming a symbol of resistance against forces trying to reshape more than just the physical landscape of Westbrook. As autumn deepened into winter, the seeds of change they'd unknowingly planted were about to break through hard ground, challenging everyone's assumptions about community, justice, and the true meaning of progress. DeAndre deserves a like for his courage, but sadly he still faces prejudice every day. Show your support by hitting that like button. Let's prove the world has more friends than enemies. The discovery came on a rain-soaked Sunday afternoon. DeAndre was helping Henry organize his garage when they found a weathered filing cabinet hidden behind decades of accumulated tools. These are from the old business, Henry explained, pulling out folders thick with yellow papers. Should have tossed them years ago, but Sarah insisted on keeping records. Thunder rumbled outside as they sorted through the documents. DeAndre's hands froze over a familiar name, Parker Construction. The folder contained correspondence from 15 years ago, when Morrison Construction had competed with Parker for city contracts. What caught his eye wasn't the contracts themselves, but the handwritten notes in Henry's precise script detailing safety violations he'd observed at Parker's sites. They were cutting corners even back then, Henry said softly, noticing DeAndre's interest. I reported them multiple times, but someone in the city always buried the complaints. His fingers traced the old papers. Your father's accident. It wasn't the first, was it? DeAndre shook his head, pulling out his own folded newspaper clipping about his father's death. As they laid the documents side by side, a pattern emerged. Henry's old reports detailed the exact same safety issues that had contributed to Marcus Mitchell's fatal fall: substandard harnesses, improperly secured scaffolding, ignored maintenance schedules. But there was more. Among Henry's papers were copies of inspection reports signed by Building Commissioner Thomas Wells, giving Parker Construction clean bills of health despite documented violations. Bank statements showed suspicious payments from shell companies traced back to Parker. Names of city officials appeared repeatedly, connected to dismissed complaints and rushed approvals. This goes deeper than just Parker, Henry muttered, spreading more papers across his workbench. Look at these property records. The documents revealed a complex web of companies, all leading back to Sterling Development and their aggressive neighborhood buyouts. Parker Construction was listed as their primary contractor. DeAndre's hands trembled as he found a more recent document, an environmental impact study for Sterling's planned development of Westbrook. The report, buried in the city's records, warned of serious foundation issues in the area. Yet Sterling's approved plans showed high-rise apartments exactly where the study advised against building. They're not just corrupt, DeAndre realized, they're putting future lives at risk. The parallels to his father's death hit him hard. Same players, same patterns, different decade. Jennifer Thompson's business card fell from one of the folders. Henry had kept in touch with the journalist since the latter incident. She needs to see this, DeAndre said, but Henry's expression was grave. These people destroyed evidence of your father's accident, he warned. They won't hesitate to do worse if they feel threatened, as if emphasizing his point. A black SUV drove slowly past the garage, its tinted windows reflecting the storm's lightning. That evening, they carefully documented everything, DeAndre's phone camera capturing every damning detail. Henry retrieved a small fireproof safe from his bedroom, adding their evidence to other documents he'd been collecting: photos of Sterling's nighttime vandalism, recordings of threatening phone calls, copies of suspicious city permits. Your father once bid against Parker for the Children's Hospital project, Henry revealed, showing DeAndre an old proposal. He found safety issues in their plans, threatened to expose them. A week later, he had his accident. The words hung heavy in the garage's dim light. They worked late into the night, organizing the evidence. Other names emerged: contractors who'd been forced out of business, families who'd lost homes to suspicious foreclosures, workers who'd suffered accidents similar to Marcus's. The corruption didn't just reach up to City Hall, its roots ran deep through Westbrook's changing landscape. What do we do with all this? DeAndre asked, overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd uncovered. The rain had stopped, but thunder still growled in the distance. Henry's eyes held a fire DeAndre hadn't seen before. We build a case just like we'd build a house. Foundation first, then walls, then roof. Everything connected, everything supporting everything else. He picked up Parker's old safety violations. Your father deserved justice. Maybe now we can finally get it. As they secured the documents in the safe, DeAndre noticed Henry's hands shaking slightly. The old contractor was right, these weren't just papers. They were weapons that could either bring justice or destroy them both. The same system that had buried his father's death would fight twice as hard to keep its secrets. Outside, the storm had passed, but a different kind of darkness pressed against the garage windows. Somewhere in the city, in offices with expensive views, people like Commissioner Wells and Sterling's executives slept soundly, confident in their power. They couldn't know that in a humble garage on Chester Avenue, two unlikely allies had just declared war. DeAndre drove home that night with a copy of the key to Henry's safe in his pocket, its weight a reminder of the responsibility they'd just assumed. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Son, sometimes the most important buildings are the ones that expose the truth." The foundation had been laid. Now they had to be ready for whatever came next. The threats began subtly at first, like the first drops of rain before a storm. DeAndre noticed increased police patrols past Henry's house, their cruisers crawling by with deliberate slowness. Officer Bradley seemed to materialize whenever DeAndre worked on the roof, his presence a constant reminder of unspoken suspicions. Sterling Development's tactics grew bolder. Their sleek black SUVs parked across the street for hours, cameras visible behind tinted windows. James Maxwell, Sterling's CEO, made an unexpected courtesy visit to Henry's home, his expensive suit out of place in the modest living room. Mr. Morrison, he'd said, his smile never reaching his eyes, accidents happen so easily to older homes, it would be a shame if something unfortunate occurred. That night, bricks crashed through Henry's front windows. DeAndre, who had stayed late helping organize evidence, pulled the older man to safety as glass shattered across Sarah's favorite armchair. When the police arrived, Officer Bradley suggested it was probably just kids, despite the Sterling Development business card left among the broken glass. The harassment escalated on multiple fronts. DeAndre's mother lost her job at the insurance company, a subsidiary of Parker Construction, they discovered later. Anonymous complaints appeared at DeAndre's school, questioning his grades and suggesting misconduct. Principal Roberts, usually supportive, began watching him with new wariness. Henry's home suffered mysterious accidents with increasing frequency. Water pipes burst in targeted locations, electrical systems malfunctioned, and new roof damage appeared overnight. Each incident was followed by Sterling representatives offering safety inspections and increasingly generous buyout offers. The message was clear: resistance had a price. DeAndre documented everything meticulously, his phone filling with photos and videos. He captured the license plates of suspicious vehicles, recorded conversations with officials, and photographed every new instance of vandalism. One evening, he caught two men tampering with Henry's car. They fled when confronted, but not before DeAndre recognized one as a former Parker construction foreman. The pressure extended into the community. Neighbors who had begun warming to DeAndre suddenly became distant again. Mrs. Peterson, who had softened her stance, posted new neighborhood watch signs specifically facing Henry's property. Local businesses that had employed Sarah Mitchell began finding reasons to reduce her hours. One rainy evening, DeAndre found Henry sitting in his darkened kitchen, staring at an old photograph of Sarah. "They offered me 3 times the house's value today," he said quietly. "Said it was their final friendly offer." His hands trembled slightly as he pushed across a thick envelope. "There's more. Someone left this in my mailbox." Inside were photo surveillance shots of DeAndre walking to school, Sarah Mitchell at her various jobs, even Henry at his doctor's appointments. A simple note read, "Everyone has something to lose." The threat was sophisticated in its simplicity. That same week, Jennifer Thompson received her own warning. Her editor suddenly reassigned her from the Westbrook development story. Citing budget constraints, when she pushed back, she found her past articles being scrutinized for accuracy concerns. DeAndre and Henry moved their evidence to a new secure location, making multiple copies. They learned to communicate in code, aware that their phones might be monitored. The garage became their war room, where they mapped connections between Sterling, Parker, and city officials on an old corkboard hidden behind storage shelves. The pressure took its toll. Henry's health began to show signs of strain, though he refused to acknowledge it. DeAndre noticed his mentor's hands shaking more frequently, his breath becoming labored after climbing just a few stairs. Yet the old contractor's determination never wavered. One Sunday morning, they discovered Henry's garden destroyed, Sarah's beloved roses uprooted and strewn across the yard. It was a calculated emotional blow. As they replanted what could be saved, Henry spoke with quiet anger. They think they can erase everything: homes, memories, lives, just like they tried to erase what happened to your father. DeAndre worked silently, his hands deep in the soil his father had once helped Sarah tend. The destruction of the garden felt personal, an attack not just on property but on the connections between past and present, between those who fought for justice and those who died seeking it. The threats were no longer just about a house or development plans. They had become a battle for the soul of Westbrook itself. Each act of intimidation reinforced what Henry and DeAndre had discovered in those old files. The corruption wasn't just in construction practices or city permits, but in the systematic destruction of community itself. As they finished replanting the last rose bush, Henry placed a firm hand on DeAndre's shoulder. "They're getting desperate," he said, "which means we're closer to the truth than they want us to be." The evening sun cast long shadows across the ravaged garden, but among the damaged plants, a few stubborn blooms still reached toward the light, refusing to be destroyed. The truth assembled itself piece by piece like a complex construction project where every element had to support the others. DeAndre and Henry converted an old blueprint table in the garage into their investigation headquarters, spreading out documents in a carefully organized pattern that revealed connections they might have otherwise missed. Jennifer Thompson, though officially removed from the story, continued meeting them secretly in the back room of Mabel's diner. Her journalistic expertise helped them understand which pieces of evidence would hold up in court and which needed stronger documentation. "It's not enough to know the truth," she explained over countless cups of coffee. "We have to prove it in a way they can't dismiss or bury." The breakthrough came when they located Marcus Mitchell's former co-worker, James Wilson. Initially reluctant to speak, Wilson finally agreed to meet them in the parking lot of a closed supermarket on the edge of town. His hand shook as he handed over a small USB drive. "I kept copies," he whispered, glancing nervously around. "Of everything. The falsified inspection reports, the emails ordering us to use substandard equipment, the payoffs to keep quiet after accidents." Wilson's evidence provided the missing links. It showed how Parker Construction had systematically violated safety regulations while bribing officials to look the other way. More importantly, it revealed the company's connection to Sterling Development. They weren't just business partners. They were part of a larger consortium that had been orchestrating Westbrook's transformation for years. Sarah Mitchell proved unexpectedly valuable to their investigation. Her multiple jobs had given her access to various offices where she'd overheard conversations and noticed patterns. She began keeping a detailed diary of suspicious activity she witnessed during her cleaning shifts at City Hall. The names she recorded matched perfectly with those in Henry's old files. They discovered other families affected by Parker's negligence. Mrs. Rodriguez's husband had been paralyzed in a scaffold collapse 3 years before Marcus's death. The Williams family had lost their father to faulty electrical wiring. Each incident had been quietly settled, the victims bound by confidentiality agreements, but the patterns were undeniable. DeAndre spent his evenings cross-referencing building permits with accident reports, his engineering knowledge helping him identify technical violations that others might miss. Henry's decades of construction experience proved invaluable in interpreting the documentation. Together, they built a timeline that showed not just individual incidents, but a systematic pattern of corruption spanning 20 years. The evidence painted a damning picture. Sterling Development had been buying properties through shell companies long before their official arrival in Westbrook. They'd used Parker Construction to deliberately neglect building maintenance, forcing residents out through natural deterioration. City officials had rezoned areas based on falsified environmental reports, while building inspectors ignored violations in exchange for bribes. Jennifer Thompson helped them organize the evidence into a compelling narrative. She brought in a friend from the district attorney's office who, speaking hypothetically, advised them on what kind of evidence would be needed for various criminal charges. The list was extensive: criminal negligence, manslaughter, fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and racketeering. They found unexpected allies. A clerk in the city planning office began slipping them copies of suspicious permit applications. A former Sterling employee anonymously emailed internal memos showing the company knew about the foundation issues but planned to build anyway. Even Mrs. Peterson, after her son was injured at a Parker construction site, quietly shared what she knew about late-night activities around Henry's property. The case grew stronger daily, but so did the risks. They established a dead man's switch. If anything happened to any of them, multiple copies of their evidence would automatically be sent to law enforcement agencies, news outlets, and advocacy groups across the country. DeAndre wrote detailed letters to be opened in case of his accident, ensuring that his father's story wouldn't be buried again. Henry's garage became a fortress of truth. They installed security cameras, backed up everything digitally, and created multiple redundant copies of their evidence. The blueprint table was covered with red string connecting photos, documents, and notes, a web of corruption made visible through their patient investigation. The human cost of the corruption became clearer as they dug deeper. They uncovered dozens of families displaced by suspicious fires in buildings Parker had declared unsafe. They found workers who'd been threatened into silence about safety violations. Each story added weight to their case, turning statistics into faces, dates into lives disrupted or lost. As autumn turned to winter, their investigation reached a critical mass. They had traced millions in bribes, documented hundreds of safety violations, and mapped out the entire corrupt network. But perhaps most damning was the evidence showing that Sterling and Parker knew their current development plans would likely lead to catastrophic failures in the future. They just didn't care. They're not just building on shaky ground, Henry observed one evening, studying the geological surveys. They're building on graves your fathers, and who knows how many others. DeAndre nodded, adding another document to their wall of evidence. Each piece of paper represented a choice between profit and human life, between corruption and justice. The case they'd built was solid, foundational, like the buildings Henry had spent his life creating. But they knew that evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed the right moment, the right venue, and the right strategy to ensure their revelations couldn't be dismissed or buried. As winter deepened, that moment approached, though none of them could have predicted exactly how it would arrive or what it would cost them all. While their investigation grew, so did the bond between Henry and DeAndre, evolving into something deeper than mentor and protege. Their shared purpose had forged a connection that transcended age and race, healing old wounds while creating new strength. Henry found himself rediscovering the passion for justice that had driven his younger years, while DeAndre gained not just knowledge but the father figure he'd lost too soon. The changes in DeAndre were particularly noticeable at school. His engineering teachers remarked on his increasingly sophisticated understanding of structural principles, not knowing he spent evenings studying both his textbooks and Henry's old construction manuals. His questions in class became more incisive, informed by real-world experience gained from both investigation and repair work. Sarah Mitchell watched her son's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. The anger that had simmered since Marcus's death was being channeled into purpose. She'd find him late at night at their kitchen table, surrounded by building codes and safety regulations, his father's old hard hat sitting nearby like a silent guardian. "You're so much like him," she'd say softly, and for the first time, DeAndre could smile at the comparison. Henry's health, however, became an increasing concern. The strain of their investigation, combined with the constant harassment from Sterling Development, took its toll. DeAndre noticed his mentor's hands shaking more frequently, his breathing becoming labored after climbing just a few stairs. Yet Henry refused to slow down, driven by a sense of responsibility that transcended his physical limitations. "I'm not just fighting for my house anymore," Henry confided one evening as they reviewed evidence in his kitchen. "I'm fighting for what your father believed in, that things should be built right. That lives matter more than profits." He paused, looking at a photo of Sarah on the wall. "My wife always said our real legacy isn't in the buildings we create, but in the principles we pass on." Their work together had unexpected effects on the community. Other teens, seeing DeAndre's dedication to helping Henry, began offering assistance to elderly neighbors. Mrs. Peterson's gradual change of heart influenced others, leading to small but significant shifts in neighborhood attitudes. The invisible barriers that had divided Westbrook for generations began showing cracks. Jennifer Thompson noted these changes in her personal journal, unable to publish them but determined to document the human side of their story. She observed how DeAndre's confidence grew, not from bravado but from the quiet certainty of someone who knew his purpose. Henry, despite his declining health, seemed energized by their mission, his eyes bright with the fire of righteous cause. The pressure on both families intensified. Sarah Mitchell lost another job, and DeAndre's college applications received mysterious administrative holds. Henry's medical insurance suddenly became problematic, with previously covered treatments now requiring extensive documentation. Yet these challenges only strengthened their resolve. DeAndre's academic performance, rather than suffering, improved. His teachers noticed a new maturity in his work, particularly in essays discussing ethics and social responsibility. When he wrote about the importance of building codes for his engineering class, his passion for the subject earned him top marks and a nomination for a statewide engineering competition. Henry found himself learning as much as he taught. DeAndre's facility with technology helped modernize their investigation methods, while his fresh perspective often revealed connections they might have missed. The old contractor discovered that mentorship was a two-way street, each teaching the other in their own way. Their evening sessions in Henry's kitchen became a blend of investigation and life lessons. Over cups of coffee and Sarah's cookie recipe, they discussed not just evidence and strategy, but deeper matters: integrity, justice, the true meaning of community. These conversations filled a void in both their lives, creating a space where wisdom could flow between generations. The physical work on Henry's house continued alongside their investigation, each repair becoming a metaphor for their larger mission. As they fixed broken windows and reinforced weathered boards, they were also rebuilding something less tangible but more important: faith in the possibility of justice. Sarah Mitchell noticed other changes in her son. The nightmares about his father's death, which had plagued him for years, became less frequent. Instead, he spoke more often of his father's principles, his dedication to doing things right. The grief was still there, but it had been transformed into purpose. Henry's neighbors began to see him differently, too. His steadfast resistance to Sterling's pressure, combined with his obvious mentorship of DeAndre, reminded many of the man who had once been a pillar of the community. Some even began sharing their own stories of encounters with Sterling and Parker, adding to the growing body of evidence. As winter approached, both men found themselves transformed by their shared mission. DeAndre had grown from a frustrated teen into a young man with clear purpose, while Henry had rediscovered the fighting spirit of his younger years. Their unlikely partnership had become something neither had expected: a bridge between past and present, between justice denied and justice pursued. One evening, as they sat on Henry's porch watching the sunset, DeAndre voiced what they both had come to understand: we're not just building a case anymore, we're rebuilding community. Henry nodded, understanding that their work had grown beyond exposing corruption. It had become about healing the very fabric of Westbrook itself. The city council meeting was scheduled for a cold December evening, ostensibly to approve Sterling Development's final plans for Westbrook's redevelopment. The chamber was packed, with James Maxwell and his Sterling executives occupying the front row, their expensive suits and confident smiles a stark contrast to the worried faces of longtime residents filling the public seats. DeAndre and Henry had chosen this moment carefully. Their evidence was ready, copies secured in multiple locations, and Jennifer Thompson had strategically placed allies throughout the room. Sarah Mitchell sat near the back, clutching a folder containing her own documentation of the corruption they'd uncovered. The air crackled with tension as Commissioner Wells began his practice speech about urban renewal and community improvement. Henry rose to speak during the public comment period, his aged frame straight and dignified despite his declining health. Before this council votes, he began, his voice steady: there are some facts that need to be addressed. Maxwell shifted uncomfortably as Henry produced the first set of documents, detailed evidence of Sterling's fraudulent property acquisitions. The chamber grew silent as Henry methodically presented their case: falsified environmental reports, fabricated safety inspections, bribes documented through shell companies. Each piece of evidence was projected onto the chamber's large screen, the truth displayed in stark detail. Commissioner Wells attempted to interrupt, citing time limitations, but the council president, sensing the gravity of the moment, allowed Henry to continue. DeAndre stepped forward next, his young voice strong with conviction. "My father, Marcus Mitchell, wasn't the victim of an accident," he declared. "He was killed by a system that values profit over human life." He played the recordings from James Wilson, revealing Parker Construction's deliberate safety violations and subsequent cover-ups. The chamber erupted in murmurs as more evidence emerged. Photos of Sterling's nighttime vandalism, documentation of threatened residents, proof of systemic corruption reaching into the highest levels of city government. Maxwell's confidence crumbled visibly as his carefully constructed facade began to unravel. That's when the unexpected happened. Robert Parker himself walked into the chamber, his presence causing a collective gasp. The aging CEO of Parker Construction moved slowly to the podium, his face grave. "I've come to correct a grave injustice," he announced, pulling out his own stack of documents. The room held its breath as Parker began to speak. He confirmed everything Henry and DeAndre had uncovered, adding his own testimony about years of corruption, bribery, and criminal negligence. "Marcus Mitchell," he said, looking directly at DeAndre, "died because I chose profit over safety. That choice has haunted me every day since." Maxwell exploded from his seat, shouting about confidentiality agreements and legal consequences. But Parker continued, revealing details about Sterling's current plans, how they knew the proposed buildings would be unsafe, how they'd planned to bypass regulations through bribed inspections. The council chamber descended into chaos. Commissioner Wells attempted to adjourn the meeting, but council members, seeing the extent of evidence, voted to continue. Jennifer Thompson was already sending live updates to her network of journalists, while legal observers present in the room began taking detailed notes. Henry swayed slightly at the podium, the emotion and exertion taking their toll. DeAndre moved quickly to support him, the two men standing together as more residents came forward to share their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about her husband's accident. The Williams family detailed their fight for justice. Each testimony added weight to their case. Maxwell and his executives attempted to leave but found their way blocked by newly arrived FBI agents. Jennifer Thompson's final strategic play. The federal investigation had been quietly proceeding for weeks, building on the evidence she'd been feeding them. As the meeting stretched into the night, the full scope of Sterling and Parker's corruption emerged. Their plan hadn't just been about building luxury apartments. They'd intended to reshape Westbrook through systematic displacement and fraud, all while knowing their buildings could potentially collapse within a decade. The council chamber, usually a place of dry procedures and rubber stamp approvals, had become a battleground for the soul of Westbrook. Long silent residents found their voices, sharing stories of intimidation and loss. City officials, seeing the federal presence, began distancing themselves from Sterling's plans. DeAndre stood firm through it all, his father's hard hat now sitting proudly on the podium beside their evidence. Henry's hand rested on his shoulder, both men drawing strength from each other as they watched their months of careful work finally bear fruit. As the meeting concluded, the council unanimously voted to suspend all Sterling development projects pending federal investigation. Maxwell was led away for questioning, his corporate armor finally cracked. Commissioner Wells resigned on the spot, aware that his own involvement would soon be exposed. They had won this battle, but as Henry and DeAndre exchanged glances, they knew this was just the beginning. The real work of rebuilding Westbrook, not just its buildings but its sense of community and justice, still lay ahead. The night's events had exposed the corruption, but healing the wounds it had caused would take much longer. In the days following the council meeting, revelations cascaded through Westbrook like a series of controlled demolitions, each disclosure bringing down another pillar of corruption. Robert Parker's testimony proved more devastating than anyone had anticipated, exposing decades of systematic fraud that went far beyond construction violations. The connection to Marcus Mitchell's death emerged in excruciating detail. Parker revealed how he'd personally ordered the use of substandard safety equipment to meet impossible deadlines set by Sterling Development. The decision had saved his company thousands but had cost Marcus his life. More shocking was his admission that James Maxwell had explicitly encouraged such cost-cutting measures, seeing worker safety as an unnecessary expense. DeAndre struggled to process these revelations. During a quiet moment in Henry's kitchen, Parker had asked to meet with him privately. "Your father," Parker said, his voice heavy with regret, "came to me the week before his death. He'd documented our safety violations and threatened to report them. I had him transferred to our most dangerous site in retaliation." The confession hung in the air like poison. Henry had known some of this truth for months, but had waited for the right moment to share it with DeAndre. He'd discovered the connection while reviewing old company records, recognizing how Parker Construction's pattern of retribution had led directly to Marcus's fatal assignment. The knowledge had weighed heavily on him, informing his careful mentorship of DeAndre. "I wanted to protect you from this truth until we could do something about it," Henry explained, watching DeAndre absorb the full impact of Parker's confession. "Your father didn't just die because of negligence. He died trying to prevent others from facing the same risks." The revelation transformed their victory into something more complex. DeAndre found himself torn between rage at the deliberate nature of his father's death and a strange respect for Parker's willingness to finally face the truth. The man's confession had helped bring down Sterling's empire, but it couldn't bring back Marcus Mitchell. Parker's redemption efforts proved substantial. He provided prosecutors with detailed records of every safety violation, every bribe, every cover-up. His testimony implicated dozens of officials and executives reaching into the highest levels of city government. More importantly, he offered to establish a fund for families affected by his company's negligence, starting with full college scholarships for children of injured or killed workers. The impact on Westbrook's development plans was immediate and far-reaching. Sterling's projects were permanently halted, their permits revoked. The environmental studies they'd suppressed were made public, revealing serious risks in their proposed construction sites. Properties they'd acquired through intimidation were placed in a community trust, with original owners given the first right to reclaim them. For Henry, watching Parker's confession stirred complicated emotions. They had been rivals and sometimes friends during Westbrook's better days before greed had corrupted the principles of their profession. Building something right means more than just following codes, Henry reflected. It means building with conscience, with respect for the lives that depend on our work. DeAndre found himself becoming a symbol of both justice and reconciliation. Other families affected by construction accidents reached out, sharing their stories and seeking his advice. The local trade school asked him to speak about workplace safety, his father's story becoming a powerful lesson for a new generation of construction workers. Jennifer Thompson's comprehensive report on the case became a blueprint for investigating similar corruption in other cities. She dedicated the series to Marcus Mitchell and all the other workers who had died due to corporate negligence, ensuring their stories would not be forgotten. The most profound impact was personal. DeAndre began to see his father's death not just as a tragedy, but as part of a larger story about courage and principle. Marcus Mitchell had died trying to protect others, and through DeAndre's efforts, that mission had finally been accomplished. Parker's redemption efforts extended to specific amends. He provided Sarah Mitchell with all the documentation surrounding Marcus's death, including his own notes from their final confrontation. "Your husband was right," he told her. "If I had listened to him, many lives might have been saved." The revelation changed Westbrook's understanding of itself. The community had to confront its own complicity in the corruption, how silence and indifference had allowed injustice to flourish. But in that confrontation came the possibility of genuine change, of building something better on the ruins of the old system. As winter deepened, DeAndre and Henry sat in the garage where their investigation had begun, surrounded by the evidence that had exposed decades of corruption. "Your father would be proud," Henry said softly. "Not just of what you uncovered, but of how you did it with integrity, with purpose." DeAndre nodded, holding his father's hard hat. The truth had cost them all dearly, but it had also set them free. Westbrook would rebuild, not just its physical structures, but its sense of community and justice. The foundation they had laid was strong enough to bear that weight, built on truth, sacrifice, and the courage to face uncomfortable realities. As DeAndre's story shows, sometimes the smallest act of support can spark huge changes. If you believe in stories that inspire change and shine light on truth, join our community by subscribing. Together, we can build something meaningful, just like Henry and DeAndre did. The backlash came swiftly and violently. 3 nights after the council meeting, as DeAndre was leaving Henry's house, a black SUV swerved onto the sidewalk, missing him by inches. The message was clear: their victory had made powerful enemies desperate enough to resort to physical intimidation. That same night, Henry's house erupted in flames. The fire department would later find evidence of accelerants strategically placed to ensure maximum damage. If it hadn't been for DeAndre forgetting his backpack and returning to find smoke billowing from the windows, Henry might not have survived. The old man was unconscious in his study, surrounded by their evidence files, when DeAndre fought through the smoke to reach him. The community's response surprised everyone. Mrs. Peterson was the first to arrive, offering her guest room to Henry without hesitation. Other neighbors followed, forming an impromptu security watch around the damaged house. The same residents who had once viewed DeAndre with suspicion now praised his heroism, spreading the story of how he'd risked his life to save Henry. Jennifer Thompson's article about the attack went viral, drawing national attention to Westbrook's struggle. Cell phone footage of DeAndre emerging from the smoke, supporting a barely conscious Henry, became a powerful symbol of resistance against corporate corruption. Local news stations camped outside the hospital, where Henry was being treated for smoke inhalation and exhaustion. The attack galvanized the community. Residents who had remained silent about Sterling's intimidation tactics began coming forward. The FBI's investigation accelerated, focusing on connections between the fire and recently terminated Sterling executives. Even Officer Bradley, witnessing the community's unity, began providing information about police involvement in the cover-ups. DeAndre refused to leave Henry's hospital bedside, completing his homework in the uncomfortable chair while monitoring the older man's vital signs. Sarah Mitchell brought them both home-cooked meals, the three forming a tight family unit against the chaos swirling outside. Hospital staff bent visitation rules, recognizing the special bond between the teenage hero and his elderly mentor. The fire had destroyed much of Henry's house, but crucially, their evidence remained secure in multiple off-site locations. The attempted destruction had only succeeded in proving their claims about Sterling's violent tendencies. Each charred wall and melted window became additional evidence of the link's corrupt powers would go to silence the truth. Henry's recovery was slow, complicated by the stress and smoke damage to his already fragile lungs. Yet even from his hospital bed, he continued directing their fight. "They think burning down a house will stop us," he wheezed to DeAndre, "but they don't understand what we're really building here." His determination inspired others, turning his hospital room into an unofficial headquarters for their growing movement. Local construction unions, energized by the attack, organized protests outside Sterling's offices. Workers shared their own stories of safety violations and threats, creating a groundswell of support for stricter industry oversight. DeAndre was invited to speak at their rallies, his father's hard hat becoming a symbol of their cause. The community's transformation was remarkable. Neighbors who had once hurried past each other now stopped to chat, sharing updates on Henry's condition and organizing support efforts. A local contractor offered to rebuild Henry's house for free, while others contributed materials and labor. The project became a symbol of collective resistance, with volunteers working alongside professional builders. Sarah Mitchell found herself surrounded by unexpected allies. Her co-workers at various jobs organized fundraisers, while local businesses offered her better positions, no longer fearing Sterling's influence. The community that had once shunned them now embraced them as symbols of courage and resilience. DeAndre's school life changed dramatically. Students who had kept their distance now sought his advice and friendship. His engineering teachers, impressed by his real-world application of construction principles, began mentoring him toward college applications. The same determination that had driven his investigation now earned him widespread respect. But beneath the community's newfound unity lay a sobering reality. The attack on Henry's house proved that exposing corruption came with real dangers. Extra security cameras were installed around Mrs. Peterson's home, where Henry was recovering. DeAndre learned to vary his routes to school, always watching for suspicious vehicles. The fire had destroyed physical structures but strengthened invisible bonds. Each act of community support, every volunteer hammer swing, built something stronger than the walls that had burned a shared commitment to justice and truth. As Henry watched from his hospital window, seeing neighbors he'd known for decades working alongside new faces, he understood that sometimes destruction could lead to unexpected restoration. Henry's health deteriorated rapidly in the weeks following the fire. The smoke damage had aggravated his existing respiratory issues, and the stress of their fight had taken its toll on his heart. Doctors spoke in hushed tones about limited time and making arrangements. But Henry refused to slow down, insisting on continuing their work from his hospital room. DeAndre noticed the changes with growing concern. Henry's hands shook more pronouncedly when reviewing documents, and his once commanding voice often trailed off mid-sentence. Yet his mind remained sharp, focused on ensuring their evidence would lead to lasting change. "Time's running short," Sonny confided during one late-night conversation. "We need to make sure everything we've built stands strong." The lessons became more urgent, more personal. Henry spent hours sharing not just construction knowledge, but life wisdom. He told stories about Sarah, about the principles that had guided his business, about the importance of building communities as well as structures. Each conversation felt like a precious gift, a transfer of legacy from one generation to the next. Sarah Mitchell recognized the pattern. She'd watched her husband do the same in his final days, passing on everything he could to their son. She began recording Henry's conversations with DeAndre, preserving his wisdom for the future. The hospital room became a classroom where the most important lessons weren't about building codes or corruption, but about integrity, perseverance, and love. One particularly difficult evening, Henry called DeAndre closer to his bed. "Your father died trying to protect others," he whispered. "I won't lie, there were times I could have spoken up, could have supported his claims. My silence then is why I couldn't stay silent when I met you." The confession hung between them, a bridge between past regrets and present purpose. DeAndre struggled with the impending loss. Henry had become more than a mentor. He was the father figure who had helped him transform grief into purpose. Their quiet evenings working on house repairs, the shared meals, the gentle guidance through both construction problems and life challenges, all of it seemed too precious to lose. Henry used his declining strength to ensure their work would continue. He recorded detailed testimonies about Sterling's corruption, signed legal documents for the prosecution, and arranged for his house to become a community center focused on construction safety and worker advocacy. Each action was a brick in the foundation of his legacy. The community rallied around them. Mrs. Peterson organized a rotation of neighbors to ensure Henry was never alone. Jennifer Thompson visited daily, recording his memories of Westbrook's history and his hopes for its future. Even Robert Parker came, seeking forgiveness and promising to honor Henry's work through genuine reform. One peaceful morning, as dawn painted the hospital room in soft light, Henry shared his final lesson. "Buildings fall, son," he said, holding DeAndre's hand. "Companies crumble. But what we built together, trust, justice, community, that's foundation work. That's what lasts." His voice was weak, but his eyes were bright with purpose. DeAndre saw the signs before the doctors did, the slight change in breathing, the peaceful relaxation of Henry's features. He had time to call Sarah Mitchell, to gather the closest neighbors. They surrounded Henry's bed as he drifted away, his last words a whispered, "Build it strong, son." The loss hit the community hard. Henry Morrison had become more than just an elderly contractor fighting corruption. He had become a symbol of resistance, integrity, and connection between generations. His death wasn't just the end of a life, but the passing of an era in Westbrook's history. For DeAndre, the grief was profound but purposeful. Each memory of their time together became a lesson, a guide for the future. Henry's voice lived on in his approach to problems, in his understanding of what it meant to build something truly lasting. The tools they had used together, the projects they had planned, all of it carried deeper meaning now. Sarah Mitchell held her son as he grieved, recognizing in his loss an echo of her own husband's death. But where Marcus's death had left them with unanswered questions and unresolved pain, Henry's passing felt like a completion, a torch deliberately passed to the next generation. In his final days, Henry had built something more valuable than any structure. He had built a bridge between past and future, between justice denied and justice achieved. His sacrifice wasn't just in his death, but in how he had lived, choosing to fight one last battle when he could have chosen comfort and silence. The reading of Henry Morrison's will took place in his partially restored house, a fitting location for his final act of building. The gathered crowd, DeAndre, Sarah Mitchell, Jennifer Thompson, neighbors, and city officials sat in respectful silence as Henry's lawyer unfolded the document. What followed would transform not just Westbrook, but the very nature of their fight for justice. Henry had left his entire estate, including the insurance payout from the fire, to establish the Morrison-Mitchell Foundation for Construction Safety and Community Development. The foundation's mission was twofold: to advocate for worker safety and to provide scholarships for underprivileged youth pursuing careers in construction and engineering. DeAndre was named as the foundation's first chairman, with Sarah Mitchell and Jennifer Thompson serving as board members. But Henry's legacy extended beyond financial provisions. His will included a detailed confession about his own role in the industry's history of negligence. He admitted to knowing about safety violations years before Marcus Mitchell's death, acknowledging how his silence had contributed to a culture of compromise. This posthumous confession strengthened their legal case against Sterling and Parker Construction immeasurably. The will also contained a surprise that brought tears to DeAndre's eyes: adoption papers, prepared but never filed, showing Henry's intention to legally make DeAndre his heir. Though death had prevented the formal adoption, the document spoke volumes about the depth of their bond. In DeAndre Mitchell, the will read, "I found not just a student or friend, but the son of my heart. His integrity and courage have taught me as much as I ever taught him." Robert Parker, present at the reading, was moved to make his own announcement. He pledged his entire personal fortune to the foundation, ensuring its work would have lasting impact. More significantly, he provided documented evidence of every safety violation his company had ever committed, along with names of officials who had helped cover them up. His testimony, combined with Henry's confession, created an unbreakable case. The foundation's first act was to commission an independent study of all major construction projects in Westbrook over the past 20 years. The results were staggering: hundreds of safety violations, dozens of preventable accidents, and a clear pattern of regulatory failure. This data became the basis for sweeping reforms in construction safety standards. Jennifer Thompson's article about Henry's legacy went national, drawing attention from major news networks. The story of an elderly contractor and a teenage boy fighting corruption resonated across the country, inspiring similar investigations in other cities. Their evidence became a template for exposing construction industry corruption nationwide. DeAndre found himself thrust into a leadership role he hadn't expected. At 17, he became the youngest person ever to head a major foundation in Philadelphia. His father's hard hat and Henry's old tool belt sat in his office, reminders of the two men who had shaped his path. Universities that had once held his applications under review now offered full scholarships, eager to be part of his story. The foundation's headquarters, established in Henry's rebuilt house, became a symbol of community resilience. Local contractors, inspired by Henry's example, offered free training programs for neighborhood youth. The garden Sarah had loved was restored and expanded into a community space where residents could gather and share stories. Mrs. Peterson surprised everyone by donating her adjacent property to expand the foundation's work. "Henry taught us that real community isn't about walls and fences," she declared at the dedication ceremony. "It's about building connections that last." Other neighbors followed her example, creating a campus dedicated to education and advocacy. The evidence Henry had collected continued to yield results. Each week brought new indictments of corrupt officials and executives. Sterling Development's entire board faced criminal charges, while Parker Construction underwent a complete restructuring under court supervision. The systematic corruption they had fought against began to crumble. Most significantly, Henry's posthumous confession sparked a movement within the construction industry. Other contractors, inspired by his honesty, began coming forward with their own stories of pressure to compromise safety standards. The Morrison Standard became shorthand for ethical construction practices. DeAndre spent long hours in the foundation's office, often working late into the night. The restored house felt different now, not haunted by loss, but filled with purpose. He could almost hear Henry's voice in the creaking floorboards, offering guidance and encouragement as he tackled each new challenge. One quiet evening, reviewing applications for the foundation's first scholarship awards, DeAndre found a note Henry had left in his old toolbox. Remember, it read, "The strongest foundations are built on truth, and the most important structures are the ones that bring people together." Looking out at the community gathering in Sarah's garden, DeAndre understood that Henry's greatest legacy wasn't in buildings or confessions, but in the connections he had helped build between people. The federal indictments came down like a series of controlled demolitions, systematically dismantling decades of corruption. James Maxwell and the entire Sterling Development Board faced multiple charges including fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The evidence Henry and DeAndre had gathered proved devastating, leading to guilty pleas that sent shockwaves through the construction industry. Commissioner Wells and 12 other city officials were arrested in pre-dawn raids, their crimes exposed through Henry's meticulous documentation. The investigation revealed a complex web of bribes, kickbacks, and falsified inspections that had endangered countless lives. The sight of these once powerful figures in handcuffs validated everything Henry and DeAndre had fought for. The justice system moved with unprecedented speed, driven by public outrage and the undeniable strength of their evidence. Robert Parker's testimony proved crucial, his detailed accounts of corruption corroborating every document Henry had collected. The trials became national news, with Jennifer Thompson's coverage earning her a Pulitzer nomination. Families affected by construction accidents finally received recognition and compensation. The Morris and Mitchell Foundation helped them navigate legal proceedings, ensuring their stories were heard and their rights protected. The Rodriguez family, the Williams family, and dozens of others found both justice and healing through the process. Sterling Development's assets were frozen and eventually seized, with the court ordering that proceeds be used to establish a victims' compensation fund. Properties acquired through intimidation were returned to their original owners or converted into affordable housing. The luxury developments that had threatened to transform Westbrook were permanently halted. DeAndre's father's case was officially reopened. The new investigation revealed that Marcus Mitchell had documented extensive safety violations before his death, evidence that had been deliberately suppressed. His posthumous vindication led to additional charges against Parker Construction's former management and enhanced safety protocols across the industry. The City Council underwent a complete transformation. New elections, monitored by federal observers, brought in reform-minded officials committed to transparency and community involvement. The first act of the new council was to pass the Mitchell-Morrison Safety Act, establishing the strictest construction safety standards in the country. Sarah Mitchell was appointed to the city's new Construction Safety Oversight Committee, her experience as both a worker's widow and an advocate making her uniquely qualified. Her presence ensured that workers' voices would never again be silenced by corporate interests. The position allowed her to finally quit her multiple jobs and dedicate herself to the cause her husband had died fighting for. Local police leadership was restructured, with Officer Bradley among those forced to resign. The new command emphasized community policing and anti-corruption measures. Young officers were required to attend training sessions at the Morris and Mitchell Foundation, learning about the human cost of ignoring community concerns. The legal victories extended beyond criminal charges. Civil suits against Sterling and Parker resulted in massive settlements, money that went directly to improving Westbrook's infrastructure and supporting worker safety initiatives. The foundation ensured these funds were properly managed, preventing them from being diverted by corrupt officials. Robert Parker's redemption became complete when he testified against his former industry colleagues. His courage in facing his own crimes inspired other executives to come forward, creating a domino effect of exposed corruption across the construction industry. The Parker Protocols became standard guidelines for corporate transparency and accountability. Mrs. Peterson, once suspicious of change, became a vocal advocate for community integration. Her testimony about the transformation she'd witnessed from prejudice to understanding, from fear to cooperation, helped heal long-standing divisions in Westbrook. Her garden club now worked alongside the foundation, creating green spaces that brought neighbors together. Jennifer Thompson's documentation of the justice process ensured transparency and accountability. Her articles chronicled not just the legal victories, but the human stories behind them: workers finding their voice, families healing from loss, communities rebuilding trust. Her work became a blueprint for investigative journalism in similar cases nationwide. The most profound justice came in the form of systemic change. Construction sites across Philadelphia adopted strict safety protocols, with independent inspectors having real authority to halt dangerous practices. Worker complaints were taken seriously, and whistleblower protections were strengthened. The industry culture that had cost Marcus Mitchell his life was finally being dismantled. DeAndre watched these changes from the foundation office in Henry's restored house, understanding that true justice wasn't just about punishment, but transformation. Each indictment, each reform, each community victory added to the foundation they had built together, a foundation of truth, accountability, and genuine change. As Westbrook rebuilt itself, not just physically but socially and ethically, the justice they had fought for became more than legal victories. It became a living testament to Henry's belief that the strongest structures are built on integrity, and that real change requires both courage to confront the past and vision to build a better future. 5 years after the fire that nearly claimed Henry's life, DeAndre Mitchell stood at the podium of his college graduation. As valedictorian of Philadelphia State's engineering school, he addressed a packed auditorium, his words carrying the weight of everything that had brought him to this moment. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she clutched both Marcus's old hard hat and Henry's worn tool belt. Beside her sat Jennifer Thompson, Robert Parker, and a delegation from the Morrison Mitchell Foundation. Even Mrs. Peterson had made the trip, now one of DeAndre's strongest supporters and a foundation board member. His speech wove together personal loss and community triumph, the story of two fathers, one lost to corruption, one gained through shared purpose, and how their legacies had shaped not just his life but an entire industry. The foundation's work had expanded beyond Philadelphia, its model for community-based oversight and worker protection adopted by cities across the country. The scholarship program, initially focused on construction safety, had grown to include community development and urban planning. Dozens of students, many from backgrounds similar to DeAndre's, were following paths that would have been impossible before. The Foundation's training center, housed in Henry's restored home, had become a national model for worker education and community engagement. Sarah Mitchell's transformation was particularly remarkable. From juggling multiple jobs to survive, she had become a respected advocate for worker safety, testifying before state legislatures and advising other cities on implementing the Mitchell-Morrison standards. Her strength and resilience inspired other families affected by construction accidents to turn their grief into purposeful action. Robert Parker had fully embraced his role in rebuilding what his corruption had damaged. His expertise, now directed toward positive change, proved invaluable in identifying and preventing safety violations. The redemption he'd found through honesty and restitution became a case study in corporate responsibility. The neighborhood around the foundation had blossomed. Where Sterling's luxury developments would have stood, community gardens and affordable housing now thrived. The integration that had seemed impossible years ago happened naturally as residents came together around shared purposes and values. Jennifer Thompson's continued coverage ensured the lessons of Westbrook's transformation wouldn't be forgotten. Her documentary series, Building Justice, chronicled how one community's fight against corruption had sparked a national movement for construction safety reform. The series earned her not just accolades but the satisfaction of seeing real change emerge from her reporting. Mrs. Peterson's evolution became symbolic of the community's larger transformation. Her initial suspicion of DeAndre had grown into fierce pride and protective devotion. Her garden club, once an exclusive gathering, now hosted community events that brought together residents from all backgrounds, ages, and ethnicities. The legal reforms sparked by their fight had lasting impact. The Mitchell-Morrison Safety Act became a model for national legislation, its strict standards and whistleblower protections making construction sites demonstrably safer. The industry culture of silence and compromise gave way to one of transparency and accountability. As DeAndre concluded his graduation speech, he shared Henry's final message about building foundations that last. The audience rose in standing ovation, not just for his academic achievement but for the broader changes his story represented. His engineering degree wasn't just a personal triumph, but a promise to continue building on the foundation Henry had helped him lay. The graduation celebration moved to the foundation headquarters, where Sarah's garden was in full bloom. Community members gathered to share stories, remembering Henry's courage and celebrating DeAndre's achievement. The house, once a battlefield in their fight against corruption, had become a symbol of victory and renewal. Looking out over the gathered crowd, DeAndre could almost hear Henry's voice in the evening breeze. Build it strong, son. The foundation they had built together of justice, community, and purpose stood stronger than any physical structure. His engineering degree would let him build safe buildings, but Henry's lessons would help him continue building something even more important, a legacy of integrity and positive change. Standing in the garden where their unlikely partnership had begun, DeAndre understood that this wasn't an ending but a continuation. The work of building justice, like the work of building community, never truly finished. Each achievement became a foundation for the next challenge, each victory a responsibility to keep moving forward. 10 years after Henry Morrison's death, Westbrook had become a case study in community transformation. The Morrison Mitchell Foundation headquarters, expanded to include several neighboring properties, hummed with activity as DeAndre prepared for the anniversary commemoration. The gardens, now stretching across what had once been contested territory, bloomed with Sarah's roses and Mrs. Peterson's carefully tended perennials. The foundation's impact extended far beyond physical structures. Its scholarship program had produced a new generation of engineers and contractors committed to ethical construction practices. The Morrison Standard was now industry shorthand for exceeding safety requirements, while the Mitchell Protocol guided whistleblower protection across multiple industries. DeAndre, now a respected engineer and community leader, had fulfilled both his father's legacies. His firm specialized in affordable housing that prioritized both safety and community needs. Each project began with community consultation, a practice that became known as the Westbrook model. His father's hard hat and Henry's tool belt still occupied places of honor in his office, tangible reminders of the principles that guided his work. Sarah Mitchell headed the Foundation's Family Support Division, turning her experience into a source of strength for others. Her programs help families affected by construction accidents navigate legal, financial, and emotional challenges. The support network she built became as crucial as the physical safety measures her husband had died fighting for. Robert Parker, in his final years, dedicated himself to educational initiatives about corporate responsibility. His frank discussions about the human cost of corruption became powerful teaching tools. Before his passing, he established an additional fund specifically for children of construction accident victims, naming it in honor of Marcus Mitchell. Jennifer Thompson's ongoing coverage evolved into a broader examination of community resilience. Her articles tracked how the changes in Westbrook rippled outward, inspiring similar transformations in other communities. The intersection of Chester Avenue and Morrison Street, where Henry's house stood, became a symbol of how justice and community could transform urban spaces. Mrs. Peterson, now in her 80s, still tended the Foundation's gardens, teaching younger residents about both horticulture and history. Her transformation from skeptic to advocate became part of the story she shared with visitors, a testament to how understanding could overcome prejudice. The physical landscape of Westbrook reflected deeper changes. Where Sterling's luxury towers would have cast shadows, community spaces thrived. The Foundation's training center hosted continuous classes in construction safety, ethical business practices, and community organizing. Workers' rights organizations maintained offices in what had once been abandoned buildings. The anniversary celebration brought together people from across the country who had been touched by Westbrook's story. Families who had found justice through the Foundation's work shared their experiences. Young scholarship recipients spoke about following in DeAndre's footsteps. Community leaders from other cities came to learn from Westbrook's example. In his anniversary speech, DeAndre emphasized the lesson Henry had taught him, that the strongest foundations are built on truth and community. He spoke about how 2 deaths, his father's tragic accident and Henry's sacrificial passing, had sparked changes that saved countless lives. The legacy they left wasn't just in safer buildings or stronger regulations, but in the understanding that real progress requires both justice and reconciliation. The gathered crowd represented Westbrook's transformation. Former adversaries sat together, sharing memories and plans for future projects. Children played in gardens that had once been battlegrounds. The community that had once been divided by suspicion and fear now stood united in purpose and pride. As evening fell, DeAndre walked through Sarah's garden, now a sprawling testament to growth and healing. He remembered Henry's final words about building things that last. The foundation they had created went beyond physical structures or legal reforms. It had built bridges between people, between past and future, between justice and healing. The next generation of Westbrook residents would grow up knowing a different reality than DeAndre had. They would know a community where safety wasn't compromised for profit, where differences strengthened rather than divided, where justice wasn't just an ideal but a lived experience. This was Henry Morrison's true legacy, not just the exposure of corruption or the implementation of reforms, but the creation of a community that understood the value of building things right from the foundation up. As stars appeared above the garden where their story had begun, DeAndre knew that their work would continue. Each new challenge would build on the foundation they had laid. Each future victory would honor the sacrifices that had made it possible. The story of Henry Morrison and the Mitchells had become more than a tale of justice. It had become a blueprint for how communities could rebuild themselves stronger and more just than before. As our story of DeAndre and Henry comes to a close, your support means the world to us. If this tale of justice, courage, and community touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button to join our storytelling family. Share this video with someone who needs inspiration today. Drop a like to help spread this message of hope, and let us know in the comments what moved you most about their journey. Should we explore what happens next in Westbrook? Together we can build something beautiful, just like DeAndre and Henry did. Your engagement helps us continue sharing stories that matter.